You're listening to the Diplomats podcast on Asian geopolitics. As always, I'm your host from New York City, Ankit Panda, editor at large at the Diplomat and a senior fellow at the Carnegie Endowment on International Peace. So, as some of our listeners may have been able to tell, the podcast and the Diplomat are in a bit of a transition right now. I recently stepped down from my former role as senior editor into my new role as editor at large. So I'm still writing at the Diplomat. I actually recently started a new blog called By Other Means, which I hope you'll check out. Most of what I'll be covering there will be familiar to listeners of the podcast. Topics in Asian geopolitics, defense technology, emerging technologies in defense, security issues around the Asia Pacific, what have you. Sort of a platform for me to just keep writing at the Diplomat and keep my presence up. But the good news is that we're actually going to have a few new voices at the Diplomat, and one of them is actually who I'm very excited to introduce to everyone today. So joining me on the show today is Abhijnan Reg. Abhijnan, thank you so much for joining me.
Thank you for having me, Ankit.
So, as some of our listeners may have seen on The Diplomat, you are our new security and defense editor. Is that right?
Yes, that is.
Terrific. So, I'm hoping to, first of all, use this episode as a way to just introduce our listeners to a new voice in the Diplomat family. So, why don't you tell us a little bit about your background and where you were before you joined the Diplomat?
Sure. So I'm a mathematical physicist by training, though now that seems like a past life for me in many ways. And in terms of my policy work, I was first fellow and then senior fellow in the Strategic Studies program at the Observer Research Foundation, New Delhi, which is a think tank. After which I took a little bit of a break for a year to work on a couple of projects of my own, including a book project that I'm working on. And my interests are varied, and in terms of what I have started covering for the Diplomat. First, as you know, as somebody who would occasionally write for the outlet, and now in my formal role, it sort of extends from obviously South Asian security issues to harder defense issues across the region, military issues involving China, but also countries like Australia. And very recently, I have jumped into looking at emerging technologies and military strategy and science and technology and policy in general.
That's terrific. So for listeners, so Abhijnan is somebody I've been talking to about South Asian security issues and reading for a very long time. So I'm really delighted that he's now in-house at the Diplomat. If you go to the site, you'll see that he's already been covering a wide range of topics, everything from Indo-US cooperation on geospatial intelligence with the slated signing of the final of the so-called foundational agreements between the two sides, to Australia's defense strategic update, to Sino-Indian relations, to emerging technology issues, intellectual property theft, China's Thousand Talents program. So my hope going forward for the for the Asia Geopolitics podcast is actually to have Abhijnan on as a more regular guest to talk a little bit about his writing and research for the Diplomat, as our interests overlap quite a bit. But yeah, Abhijnan. So I mean, when it comes to the Indo-Pacific landscape today, obviously, the 2020 has been a landmark year in so many ways, just because of the pandemic, the attendant rise in friction along, primarily China's periphery, everywhere from the South China Sea to the Himalayas, what we'll talk about in a little more detail today. But what are some of the specific security issues that have jumped out to you this year that you think just haven't been getting the kind of attention or coverage that they deserve?
See, I mean, for me, sitting where I do, which is in New Delhi, this is the year where the world realized that India is a frontline state when it comes to either managing Chinese bad behavior or facing the brunt of Chinese bad behavior, as the case may be. So, in many ways, that is how I think I'd remember this year going forward. Because typically, when you think about India and India's security challenges, people associate India with Pakistan, maybe also with Kashmir, but never quite in terms of China. By the way, a related realization, I think, for a lot of us have been the fact that Kashmir in itself is a trilateral dispute. It involves three parties, right? Or rather, what used to be the former state of Indian state of Jammu and Kashmir, which now has two Indian territories, Jammu and Kashmir and Ladakh since August last year. So you realize because of Aksai Chin, because which is a large part of Ladakh that China occupies and India claims, and the history is very convoluted, goes back 150 years. Um, uh, because of all of this, there is a realization, I think, across the globe that Kashmir is also a three-way dispute, and this has been the case for a very long time. So I would say, in terms of South Asia, these would be, or Southern Asia rather, these would be things that would stand out when we look at this year going ahead.
Mm-hmm.
The other thing that at least for me that has been very noticeable has been how Australia has also emerged as another frontline state, maybe not frontline in a geographical sense, but in terms of how they have been dealing with uh, various Chinese actions, both inside the country in terms of influence and economic coercion, but also in the South China Sea. So as I look at the strategic landscape, I would say India, China, Pakistan as a problem, as a three-way problem, and Australia at the other end in the Pacific as a frontline state. So this would be where uh, this would be my starting point essentially.
Absolutely. Yeah, and
Going
I'm hoping, going forward, we'll be able to talk a little bit more about Australia's role in the Indo-Pacific. It's something we've talked about on the podcast on and off. I recently had Ashley Townshend from the United States Study Center in Sydney, and we talked in some depth about Australia's defense strategic update and basically strategic thought in Canberra about shifting geopolitical dynamics in the Indo-Pacific today. And I hope to revisit many of these themes with you over the coming months and years as you get settled in at the Diplomat. Today, I'm hoping to go back to a theme that's been a little bit more recently covered on the podcast, which is the ongoing Sino-Indian tensions along the border. So you've already alluded to this and set us up nicely for this discussion by talking a little bit about Aksai Chin and the trilateral nature of that dispute. I remember last year, I think you and I had a couple brief exchanges on Twitter about this very specific issue and the effect that India's bifurcation and the decision to do away with Article 370 of the Indian Constitution would have on Sino-Indian border. And I'm happy to say that I wrote an article last year basically saying that something that India can expect is more trouble along this border because
Sure.
the Chinese Foreign Ministry wasn't too coy when that happened, right? They strongly objected. And then, of course, this year we have a major standoff. And, I've been talking to other folks. We had MIT's Taylor Fravel on the podcast recently, and I think he concurred that, a lot of this goes back to the 2017 standoff in Doklam. But so what's been interesting, I'm not going to bore our listeners who've been listening to the show by recounting what happened in the Himalayas. There's a previous episode that we did with Taylor where we covered this in some detail. But what's been interesting is the fact that we've settled now into this stalemated situation where the two sides keep having these military talks. Little progress is made, and in the meantime, the Indian government keeps things really, is keeping a tight lid on things. It's not very keen to talk about what's happening along the border. The information we're getting is from a very small group of very dedicated and skilled reporters doing work from this region. But, how do you make sense of the current dynamics between the two countries in sort of managing this dispute? What exactly are the foundational factors that have led to this turning into a stalemate?
Well, the fact that things have come to a halt shouldn't come as a surprise, essentially, right? Because if you look at uh, one of the specific stand-up points, the Pangong Lake, you realize that the claims and counterclaims are very nebulous, and I'm sure that you have discussed this with Taylor Favell and others in the previous episodes. So what's going on with at the Pangong Lake is this, right? Just to quickly recap. the story is that India's claim line, or rather India's claim of where the line of actual control lies goes to a feature called Finger 8. Meanwhile, China's goes to to Finger 2. So then, in between these two features, essentially you have a gray zone, right? So there is no line, depending on weather patterns and seasons and so on and so forth. Both sides would patrol up to certain points, and things were fine. Now, what happened is that you had China making permanent construction, blacktopping a road leading from Finger 8 to Finger 4, which effectively, as far as India is concerned, is shifting the line of actual control. Now, rather ignoring the fact that there is no line in the line of actual control. It's kind of something that sits in people's head. This is a shift of status quo as far as India is concerned, and this very specific spot, the spot between Finger 2 and Finger 8 and along the Pangong Lake, is where the trickiest part of the negotiations are going. So the state of play right now is this. China proposed in the last round of military talks that there be a mutual disengagement at that spot, which meant that if China moves back from Finger 4 up to a point, India will also have to move back, right? But effectively, India rejected this, right? India said Chinese troops have to go back all the way back to Finger 8, and so that's the cause of the stalemate at this point. So that's the very nitty-gritty sort of tactical details about what's going on. But what is very interesting is that, as you rightly pointed out, the Indian government is keeping a tight lid on the whole story. So you don't really know what's really going on, other than relying on the reports of certain reporters and journalists. But at the same time, now you see the Indian Chief of Defense Staff, General Bipin Rawat, issuing an open military threat, or issuing a statement that tantamounts to a military threat, where he said yesterday something along the lines that all options, including military ones, are on the table if these talks fail, knowing very well that the talks are deadlocked, right?
Right.
Because the talks are essentially being led by the militaries of both sides. Though I should emphasize that there's perhaps some talks going on through other political channels that you don't hear about, right? Which for example, we now know that the National Security Advisor of India was in touch with the state councillor very early on in the crisis. So I don't know what's going on there, but at least officially it's being led by military, and the military, the chief of the Indian Defence Staff saying all military, all options, including kinetic ones, are on the table.
Yeah.
So I think that's the interesting bit.
Yeah. So I actually I want to dig into that a little bit more. And yeah, absolutely, as you noted, that there are these parallel tracks of talks taking place. And of course, I think maybe what's worth emphasizing, again, I don't want to go too much into the tactical details because we've already done a podcast on that. But I think what's very interesting about this year's standoff is that it's not just Chumar, it's not just Depsang, it's not just Doklam, it's not just Tawang. I mean, this time it is multiple points, primarily in the western sector. We had an initial incident in May in the Sikkim sector, which nominally is a settled border, but it is multiple transgressions at the same time. So it's just different in scope. And obviously, the June 15th fatalities of 20 Indian soldiers and an unknown number of Chinese casualties, I think really emphasized and really, I think, elevated this on in terms of global headlines. The whole world was kind of asleep to this dispute taking place, and when that happened, I think that it really popped onto front page news everywhere around the world. But I want to come back to your reference to statements made yesterday. So we're taping this on August 25th. On Monday, August 24th, General Bipin Rawat, the Chief of Defense Staff, the inaugural Chief of Defense Staff in India, by the way, made this very interesting remark. And on some level, So on some level, it should be non-controversial for a senior military official to point out to the press that military options exist. That is the military's job. It is to prepare options for political leadership, if and when they choose to exercise those options. But what's been interesting, and for anybody following security issues in India, I mean, Bipin Rawat has a bit of a history with perhaps overstepping his portfolio when it comes to speaking for the political leadership. India has a very particular tradition of civil-military relations where military leaders generally, with notable historical exceptions, do not play a forward role in the foreign policy process, unlike a certain neighbor to India's west. But it's interesting that Rawat, I mean, he specifically says the military option to deal with transgressions by the Chinese army in Ladakh are on, but it will be exercised only if talks at the military and diplomatic level fail. So he's sort of setting this red line condition, which to me, I mean, I think that's a little bit dangerous for a military officer to go to that extent and really lay out this option. I mean, on one level, I think he might think that this is making or empowering the negotiators to convey to China that there will be credible costs if these negotiations fail. But then again, I have to ask myself, I mean, is this really going to succeed in convincing the Chinese that they should shift their negotiating positions? I mean, not really. So I'm wondering, how you made sense of that.
No, first of all, Ankit, while General Rawat was perhaps in a characteristic way blunt and also stated the obvious. This is not the first time that a senior Indian leader has issued or made a statement along this direction. So, if you remember, when Rajnath Singh, who's India's defense minister, visited Ladakh, right after that, he also made an oblique statement, perhaps saying that the army should be ready for any eventuality. Right? Mm-hmm. So that is, you have had that. Much more dramatically, you had the prime minister's visit to Ladakh, and it made for very striking imagery in many ways, where you had the prime minister being flanked by the defense by the Indian chief of defense staff, the army chief, and the local commanders, all together. So there has been these sort of, if you wish, demonstrations that India means business, and that it's simply not going to allow China to change the status quo. But coming back to what General Rawat could have alluded to, see, in my mind, there are just two possibilities here. Right? One possibility is that it is for domestic consumption, and the other possibility, logically speaking, is that it's a threat. Right? Now, the domestic, what is baffling about both is that at many levels, neither of them make sense. And I'll tell you why. The domestic consumption bit does not make sense, because if you look at the Prime Minister's recent popularity ratings, right, they're very high, right? Despite alleged mishandling of the COVID-19 pandemic, and obviously China and certain opposition parties making a lot of noise about both, the Prime Minister's ratings remain very high, right? Which means that this crisis is not going to cast a shadow on upcoming state elections, which is something that I wondered at some point. So before the ratings were published, that's one. So why would you make a statement of this sort if it is not for domestic consumption? Here, parenthetically, you should also keep in mind that General Rawat is politically very well connected to the Prime Minister's party, to the Bharatiya Janata Party, even though his official post is completely apolitical due to the country's civil-military relations patterns that you refer to. So the domestic consumption part clearly doesn't make sense. Plus, there is also a very real danger here that following this statement, the Chinese will dig in. They'll just say, to hell with the talks. Let's not even keep up the facade of talking, and you do what you have to do, right? So there's that danger. So that's the domestic consumption. Now, let's look at the other logical possibility, right? This is a threat for the Chinese. Now, even that, to my mind, is a little confusing, because threat to what end, right? because the
Hmm.
Chinese very well know that India reserves the right to exercise the kinetic option. I mean, many divisions worth of troops present there. Certain weapon systems have been sent in, and so on and so forth. So China knows very well, right, that there is this option that India can exercise. So the threat part probably also is a little confusing, because at the same time, by the way, if you keep on saying, well, we reserve the right to exercise the military option, then you better do it when the time comes, or you have egg on your face. That's one problem. Or B, there is the possibility that the Chinese may try to preempt you, fearing a surprise attack, right? Because
Sure.
if they take
Hmm.
your threat too seriously. So these are the factors to my mind which makes General Rawat's statement a little confusing, because you can't really understand who is his target audience, right? Who is he targeting when he's making this statement? Is it uh, India's public, or the core base of the Bharatiya Janata Party, the Prime Minister's party, or is it the Chinese?
Right. I mean, it's yeah, and that is the peril of signaling. It is often messy business and doesn't necessarily work as intended a lot of the time. And I think we've noticed that
That's right.
a fair bit in India-China crises. I mean, certainly Doklam. I
That's
think I can think of 5 or 6 similar examples from that crisis that
sure.
come to mind. But something else I wanted to take the opportunity to address. We are running a little short on time, but I wanted to get to this with you. Is so one of the trends that we have seen in India since we last did a podcast on this theme is India has begun to take steps asymmetrically to retaliate or impose costs on China, and a lot of these have been in the economic realm, and quite frankly, to anybody looking at the broader geopolitical scope of issues concerning economic competition with China, the scope isn't quite exciting, right? India was out front in banning 59 Chinese apps, including TikTok, before that became an issue in the United States. India has quietly in recent days taken steps to sideline Huawei, the Chinese tech
Mm.
giant, without taking necessarily formal steps to provide top-down economic guidance. But tell our listeners a little bit about why exactly this has been a reaction this time around, when during Doklam or previous crises we didn't necessarily observe India take these kinds of steps. There was a much rosier compartmentalization
Yes.
of the crisis, where India understood that the border remained unsettled and there would continue to be skirmishes with China along the border, but the economic relationship could continue to veer between competition and cooperation. Now it's a lot more confrontational on the
That's
on the economic front.
Um, so first of all, Ankit, if you look at the last 4 years of India-China relations, right? I mean, things have gotten progressively worse, by the way. But to imagine that India had never contemplated any economic retaliation against China would perhaps not be completely true. I'll give you an example. When in 2016, uh, China essentially and effectively blocked India's entry to the nuclear suppliers group. Right? There were reports in the press that suggested that officials were contemplating some action against Chinese foreign direct investment to India. Right now, these obviously they were not acted upon at that point. These recommendations or these proposals, but which you now saw, where this year from this year on there is a law that requires Chinese investors to seek government approval before they invest in India. So it's no longer automatic. So that's one part. But I think what had happened is the symbolism of 20 Indian, 21 rather, Indian soldiers being clubbed to death, right? And if you the Indian media's coverage of what happened after the June 15th clash, it was fairly graphic at places, right? So for a Hindu nationalist party that prides itself on as being the protector of Mother India, right? Because India, for a lot of the Indian, for a lot of the country's right wing, is literally a mother figure, right? So for that party to not act, being in power, having the political mandate that it does enjoy, when you had 21 Indian soldiers being killed in these frontiers, it's frankly not something that could have happened, and I think the Prime Minister realized this very well. But at the same time, what do you do? I mean, you can't go to war clearly because of the obvious costs involved. So they found some very clever way to assuage public anger and also tell China that they mean business. And that's where, for example, the ban on 59 apps, including TikTok, that's where that comes in. Because by the way, then that India's decision in itself was noted around the world, and so that's that. But and then you also have now rumors essentially that Huawei will be not allowed into the 5G trials. I say rumors because there is a lot of kite flying that happens in this town, where something is proposed just to sense how things will go, and they're quietly walked back. But there is that. But beyond all of this, right? Oh, and of course, then there was these tightening of visas. Visas for Chinese to India were already fairly difficult, as it has been the case for when it came to visas for Indians to China, and you have these tightening. But these, I think the government is trying to sort of say, look, we are doing something, because there's this fear that what are you doing, right? And fear people would ask, so what are you doing? So there's this, part of it is the performance. So that's happening, because when you look at the trade, the real meat of the economic relationship, which is the bilateral trade between these two countries, it's completely asymmetric and in favor of China. I mean, there's simply, let's say you ban all trade with China. I mean, it's impossible. I mean, it's an absurd thought, but it's a thought experiment. You can think about that. And if you do so, you ask, how much damage are you doing to China at the end of the day? Right, which is not much, and how much damage are you doing to yourself in the process? Mm-hmm. So between that being a factor, between kinetic options being rather unpalatable, the government had to strike a note of some sort, and then you see these technology related actions against Beijing.
Yeah, and something I'm hoping to dig into in a future episode is looking at how India is now apparently, geoeconomically bandwagoning with other countries around the region. I mean, we talk a lot about the Quad, but it's interesting to see, for example, that India, Japan, and Australia have now started consultations on a trilateral supply chain resilience initiative, right, which is quite interesting to reduce dependence on China. But yeah, I mean, this idea that India can weaponize its market against China. I mean, particularly against, tech companies in China, TikTok, Huawei, where India is actually seen as a major prize to be won in the Indo-Pacific. Right. There, I think, India definitely sees itself having some degree of leverage and is apparently willing to use that. So that's been quite interesting to observe as well. But unfortunately, Abhijit, we are out of time. But, I hope that this is going to be the first of many podcasts together. And once again, welcome aboard to the Diplomat, and I look forward to having you back on.
Thank you, Ankit. It was really real fun doing this, and I hope to be back for other episodes as well.
For listeners, if you've been a subscriber to the podcast but you haven't yet left us a review, we'd really appreciate if you could do that. It really helps get the word out about the show. And if you haven't yet subscribed, please do so. We'd love for you to keep up with future coverage on this podcast. Finally, before we close, a quick note from our sponsor. This episode of the Asia Geopolitics podcast is brought to you by Diplomat Risk Intelligence, or DRI. DRI is the consulting and analysis division of The Diplomat, the Asia-Pacific's leading current affairs magazine. Since its launch in 2002, The Diplomat has been dedicated to quality analysis and commentary on events and trends in Asia and around the world, and is now one of the most respected publications covering the region. DRI inherits this approach and offers clients in the private, public, and nonprofit sectors worldwide access to an exclusive network of subject matter experts and analysts. Whatever your needs in the wider Asia-Pacific region, DRI can offer the knowledge and expertise necessary to anticipate and manage geopolitical and geoeconomic risks. For more information, please visit dri.thediplomat.com. Thanks a lot for listening, and we'll be back soon with more.